The meeting that began in silence. The evening sun cast a warm golden glow over the streets of Delhi, where the air carried a strange stillness, as if the city itself knew that something important was about to happen. Outside the gates of the Prime Minister's residence, reporters gathered in tight clusters, their cameras ready, their voices buzzing with speculation. They were waiting for one man, a man who had risen from a modest background to lead one of the world's most powerful technology companies. Sundar Pichai stepped out of the black car with quiet grace, his simple white shirt and calm eyes reflecting neither arrogance nor fear. For him, this wasn't just another meeting. It was something deeper, something personal. As he walked through the gates, his heart carried memories of his mother sitting silently by the window of their small Chennai home, watching him leave. For America decades ago with nothing but a suitcase and her blessings. Inside, the Prime Minister's residence was calm but charged with anticipation. Narendra Modi had arranged a private meeting, away from flashing cameras and political speeches. Sundar was escorted through long corridors, the walls lined with paintings of leaders, battles, and moments that shaped a nation. He remembered walking similar corridors at Google's headquarters, where the walls celebrated innovation and ideas. Now, he stood at the intersection of two worlds, his Indian roots and his global responsibilities. As he entered the room, Modi rose to greet him with a firm but warm handshake, his eyes sharp yet curious. "Welcome home, Sundar," he said softly. Those three words carried weight. They were not a formality. They were a reminder of origin, of belonging, of expectation. They sat facing each other at a round table, no papers, no screens, no aides, just two men and a quiet room. The first few minutes were marked by silence, not the uncomfortable kind, but the heavy, thoughtful kind that forces hearts to speak before words do. Sundar's mind drifted to his mother, Lakshmi Pichai, who had raised him with quiet strength, never complaining when times were hard, never pushing him but always believing. Her silence had shaped him more than any speech ever could. Modi began slowly, speaking not like a politician, but like someone probing the soul of a story. "Your journey," he said, "has inspired millions. But I want to hear about the woman who gave you the courage to take the first step." Sundar's throat tightened unexpectedly. This wasn't a question about business strategy or technology. This was about the heartbeat behind his success. He spoke of Lakshmi, her simplicity, her resilience, her quiet way of holding the family together when money was scarce. He described how she would sit with him on their small balcony, watching the neighborhood lights, telling him without words that the world was vast and he must not fear it. Modi listened intently, not interrupting, his fingers gently tapping the table as if counting the rhythm of each word. Outside, the faint sound of the city life continued, but inside that room it was as if time had slowed. When Sundar spoke about the day he left for America, his mother hadn't cried. She had simply pressed his hand and whispered, "Don't forget who you are." That sentence had guided him through countless boardrooms, decisions, and sleepless nights. Modi leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Do you know why I asked you here today?" Sundar shook his head. "Because leadership is not measured only by innovation or wealth," Modi said. "It is measured by the silent values that shape your choices." Your mother's silence carried strength. And this country needs that kind of strength now more than ever. Those words struck Sundar deeply. He had prepared for discussions about India's digital future, policy frameworks, or collaborative ventures, but he had not prepared for this, an emotional mirror held up to his soul. He felt both humbled and uneasy. There was something more behind Modi's words, something he wasn't saying yet. The conversation shifted to the state of the nation's young minds, the millions of children in rural villages who had dreams but no pathways. Sundar spoke with clarity about technology's power to bridge gaps, but Modi interrupted gently. "Technology is a tool, Sundar. It needs hands that believe, not just systems that work. Then he mentioned a project, something quietly initiated by a small group of women in southern India, inspired by Lakshmi Pichai's story that had been shared in whispers through community circles. They had named it the Silent Strength Initiative. Sundar's heart skipped a beat. He had never heard of it. How could strangers be inspired by his mother when he himself had not spoken publicly about her in detail? Modi explained that these women had started building digital literacy programs in their village, telling children stories about Lakshmi's patience and resilience. It wasn't an organized program, but it had grown rapidly through word of mouth. Now the government was considering supporting it, but they wanted Sundar's involvement, not just as a figurehead, but as someone who could bring global vision to a local heartbeat. Sundar listened, feeling something shift inside him. For years he had spoken on grand stages about innovation, but this was personal. This was his mother's legacy returning to him through strangers. As the meeting neared its end, Modi stood and walked toward a small wooden box on a shelf. He opened it and took out an old, neatly folded handkerchief. "This was sent to us anonymously," he said, handing it to Sundar. The fabric was familiar. Sundar froze. It was his mother's. She had embroidered his initials into one corner when he was a boy. "It arrived with a note," Modi continued. "It said, 'Silent strength travels where words cannot.'" Sundar's hands trembled slightly as he held it. A wave of memories rushed over him. His mother waving from the balcony, her quiet prayers every night, the way she would fix his collar before school. He looked up at Modi, who simply said, "Your story is not finished, Sundar. It's returning home." The car ride back felt different. The city lights blurred past the window, but Sundar wasn't seeing them. His fingers traced the embroidered edge of the handkerchief as if holding on to something that time had almost taken away. He thought about the women, the children, and the unexpected turn this meeting had taken. Something inside him knew this wasn't just a symbolic gesture. This was the beginning of a journey that would test his values more than any boardroom challenge ever had. And somewhere far away, in a quiet house in Chennai, his mother sat by the window as she always did, unaware that her silent strength had become the foundation of something far bigger than she could imagine. As the car approached the hotel, Sundar's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was a single line. "We waited for your return. Tomorrow at dawn." He stared at it, confused yet intrigued. There was no name, no location, just that sentence. Something told him this was connected to what Modi hadn't fully revealed. He looked once more at the handkerchief, folded it carefully, and placed it close to his heart. The night was silent, but its silence carried a promise. The next dawn would bring more than he expected. The message at dawn, the morning arrived with a faint mist curling over the streets of Delhi, softening the noise of a city that never truly sleeps. Sundar Pichai sat by the hotel window, holding a cup of tea he had barely touched, his mind replaying the words on the mysterious message he had received the night before. "We waited for your return. Tomorrow at dawn." He had read it again, and again trying to decode its meaning, feeling both curiosity and unease tighten inside him like a quiet storm. It didn't sound like a corporate invitation, nor a political summons. It carried a sense of personal history, something ancient and intimate, as if the words came from a place far beyond official schedules and press conferences. When the sky turned pale blue, he decided to follow the pull of his intuition rather than the comfort of logic, a rare choice for a man used to algorithms and strategies. He changed into simple clothes, a plain shirt and dark trousers, and left the hotel without his usual entourage. The city was still waking up, vendors setting up their carts, stray dogs wandering quietly, temple bells ringing softly in the distance. His car waited at the curb, but he told the driver to stay back. Instead, he began to walk through the narrow streets near India Gate, following nothing but a feeling. as if his feet somehow remembered a path his mind did not. After a few turns, he noticed a woman in a pale sari standing beside a bicycle holding a folded newspaper. She seemed out of place, neither a passerby nor a vendor, standing too still for the chaos around her. When he approached, she looked at him calmly, then silently handed him a small envelope and nodded toward the east, where the sun was rising behind the smog. Before he could ask anything, she got on her bicycle and disappeared into the growing crowd. The envelope was made of handmade paper, delicate yet purposeful, with a faint smell of sandalwood. Inside, there was a single map, hand-drawn, leading to a location on the outskirts of the city. At the bottom, in the same handwriting as the message, were 5 simple words: "Come alone. Bring your truth." Sundar stood there for a moment, his rational mind whispering warnings, his cautious side reminding him of security protocols. But something deeper told him that this wasn't a threat. It was a calling. He arranged for a quiet ride and headed toward the marked location. The car weaved through dusty roads and eventually stopped near a cluster of ancient banyan trees, their roots hanging like silent witnesses of time. A small temple stood nearby, its white paint fading, its bells swaying gently in the breeze. As he stepped out, he noticed a group of older women sitting under the trees, dressed in modest cotton saris, their eyes kind but piercing, as if they had been waiting for him not just since yesterday but for years. One of them, with silver hair tied in a neat bun, stood up slowly and approached him with quiet authority. "You are Lakshmi's son," she said in a low, steady voice. Hearing his mother's name spoken so simply in this unexpected place made Sundar's chest tighten. "Yes," he replied softly. The woman's eyes softened even more, and she gestured for him to follow her. They led him to a shaded courtyard where children sat cross-legged on the ground, learning to use tablets and reading books in both English and Tamil. It was a humble learning center, nothing fancy, but it was alive with an energy that felt real and pure. One of the younger women explained that this place was part of the Silent Strength Initiative, the movement inspired by his mother's quiet resilience. They had built these centers across a few villages and towns, not with government funds or corporate backing, but through shared community effort. "Your mother's story reached us not through headlines," she said, "but through whispers between women who understood what it meant to hold a family together without ever demanding praise." Sundar walked slowly through the courtyard, watching the children's faces light up as they learned to code simple programs or read stories about changemakers from around the world. He felt something stir inside him, a sense of purpose that boardroom targets had never quite awakened. This was not about technology alone. It was about human connection, about giving power to those who had always been quiet but strong. As he sat with the women under the banyan tree, they began telling him stories about his mother he had never heard before. Apparently, Lakshmi had once visited a village in Tamil Nadu after Sundar had left for America, quietly helping a group of widows set up small businesses using basic tools. She never mentioned it to anyone, not even her family. She believed that kindness didn't need announcements. One of the women pulled out an old black and white photograph from a cloth pouch. It showed Lakshmi standing beside a group of village women holding a small sewing machine, her smile soft but radiant. Sundar stared at the photo, feeling a lump in his throat. He realized that while he had been building a global empire of technology, his mother had been building invisible bridges between hearts, one quiet act at a time. The silver-haired woman leaned closer and said something that struck him deeply. "Your mother's silence was never emptiness." It was a language we understood. But now, her silence has brought you here, and you must decide whether you will listen or just visit. The question hung in the air, heavy and challenging. Sundar didn't have an immediate answer. He had come to India expecting to talk about policies and innovation, but he found himself standing at the crossroads of his personal legacy and his professional identity. He looked around the courtyard again, at the women who carried quiet strength, and at the children whose futures depended on someone choosing to listen. As he was leaving the courtyard, the silver-haired woman handed him a folded cloth. Inside it was a handwritten letter, the ink slightly faded. "Your mother left this with us the last time she came," she said. She said you would return one day, not for power, but for purpose. Sundar's hands trembled slightly as he held the letter. He didn't open it immediately. Something inside told him that its words were meant to be read when his heart was ready, not just when his hands were steady. He stepped into the car, the sounds of morning prayers echoing faintly behind him. He looked at the map again, the temple fading in the distance. And for the first time in years, he felt unsure of what his next move should be. As the car turned back toward the city, Sundar finally unfolded the letter. His mother's handwriting was unmistakable, gentle and graceful. The first line made his heart stop for a moment. If you are reading this, it means the world has begun to ask something greater of you than success. He continued reading, each word cutting through layers of time and distance, reminding him of the values he had carried but often buried beneath responsibility. Then came the final line. When silence speaks, will you answer, my son? Before he could fully process the weight of it, his phone buzzed again. This time, the message was from an unknown number, but it was different. The Prime Minister will call tonight. Things are moving faster than expected. Be ready. Sundar looked up at the road ahead, his mother's letter on his lap, the map beside him, and the morning light slowly piercing through the mist. Something was unfolding, and he knew the next step would not just test his intellect, but his heart. The call that shifted the ground. The night settled over Delhi like a heavy velvet curtain, quiet yet charged with an invisible current. Sundar Pichai sat alone in the hotel room, the letter from his mother resting open on the table beside him, its words still echoing inside him like a distant prayer. He had read it multiple times since morning, and each time a different line struck deeper, peeling away layers of the polished exterior he had built over the years. He had always believed that leadership was about strategy, execution, and innovation, but his mother's quiet handwriting suggested something far more personal and demanding. The unknown message earlier that day had hinted that the Prime Minister would call at night, and though Sundar was used to calls with world leaders, this one felt different. It wasn't about business. It felt like destiny, knocking softly but insistently. The call came precisely at 9, sharp and deliberate. The Prime Minister's voice was calm, but carried an undercurrent of urgency. Sundar, he began without formalities, what you saw this morning was not an accident. The Silent Strength Initiative has grown beyond anyone's expectation. It has reached corners of the country even the state programs couldn't touch. But something has happened. Something we didn't foresee. Sundar sat up straighter, his heartbeat quickening slightly. Modi continued, a group of rural educators, inspired by your mother's legacy, has been targeted by powerful local groups who see their growing influence as a threat to old structures. The women who run these centers are facing pressure, intimidation, even silent resistance from those who fear change. We can protect them with policy and words, but they need something more powerful, representation. Someone who can give this movement a voice that cannot be ignored. Sundar listened, his mind racing. Why me? He asked softly. There was a pause on the line, followed by Modi's measured response. Because you are not just a global leader. You are a son of this soil. You carry the story that built this initiative without even knowing it. Sometimes a movement needs more than resources. It needs a face that makes the world pay attention. And whether you like it or not, Sundar, that face is yours. The weight of those words pressed down on him. He had always been careful about how he involved himself in social issues back home. As the CEO of a global company, every step he took was scrutinized. But this wasn't a public relations campaign. This was a call to something deeply personal. After the call ended, Sundar walked to the balcony, looking down at the quiet city below. Delhi at night had a way of hiding its chaos under soft lights and distant horns, but his mind was anything but calm. He thought about the women under the banyan tree, the children learning with quiet joy, the photograph of his mother helping strangers without ever mentioning it. He thought about the letter on the table, where she had asked him whether he would answer when silence spoke. He felt as if two worlds were colliding within him, the one built on global boardrooms and the one rooted in his childhood, in his mother's silent sacrifices and gentle strength. And for the first time, he couldn't separate them. Early the next morning, Sundar visited the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi. where a private roundtable had been arranged with education leaders, rural activists, and some senior officials. It wasn't on his official itinerary, but Modi had quietly facilitated it. As he entered the room, he immediately felt the mix of reverence and expectation. These were people who had worked tirelessly on the ground, often without recognition. They looked at him not as a corporate figure, but as someone who carried a symbolic legacy. One elderly educator, her voice firm despite her frail frame, said, "Your mother's story became our blueprint. We built something strong because she showed us what quiet strength looks like. But now the noise is getting louder. We need someone who can make silence heard on a larger stage." They presented data, testimonies, and stories. Sundar listened with an attentiveness that surprised even himself. These weren't polished presentations. They were raw truths. A teacher from a remote village in Odisha shared how girls who had never touched a computer were now teaching their parents basic digital literacy. A young boy from a rural school spoke shyly but proudly about building a simple mobile app that helped farmers track water usage. These were stories of transformation, not through money, but through trust and persistence. But then the tone shifted. One activist explained how powerful intermediaries, threatened by the initiative's growing influence, had begun cutting off local support, spreading misinformation, and trying to dismantle their progress through fear. It wasn't open conflict, it was silent sabotage. As the discussions deepened, Sundar felt something awaken inside him. He had spent years leading innovation on a global scale. But here, innovation was raw, human, and fragile. It didn't need just funding. It needed protection, vision, and a bridge between worlds. And he realized that bridge could only be built by someone who understood both worlds. He didn't give a speech that day. He simply listened, absorbing every word. But when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, more personal. "When I left India," he said slowly, "my mother told me not to forget who I am. I thought I understood what she meant. But after meeting all of you, I realize I have only begun to understand." After the meeting, as Sundar was about to leave, a young girl, no more than 12, approached him hesitantly. She handed him a small notebook. "This is for you," she said shyly. Inside were handwritten letters from dozens of children across rural schools, thanking him for inspiring their teachers, even though he had never directly met them. One line in particular caught his eye. "We don't need superheroes, we just need someone who doesn't walk away." Those words struck him like a sudden gust of wind. They were simple, innocent, but piercingly true. Leadership wasn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes it was about choosing not to turn away when silence asked for a response. That night, Sundar sat alone again, this time at the hotel desk. The letters from the children spread before him, the map still folded nearby, and his mother's letter resting under his hand. He realized that something irreversible had shifted within him. What had started as a formal meeting with the Prime Minister had turned into a deeply personal journey. He was no longer just visiting India. He was being called back to its heartbeat. Just before midnight, a courier arrived at his door with a sealed brown envelope marked "Confidential." Inside, there were documents detailing growing tensions in one of the key villages where the Silent Strength Initiative had gained momentum. There were signs of planned disruptions, whispers of something larger brewing beneath the surface. Attached to the documents was a handwritten note. "They will test your silence before they hear your voice. Decide soon." Sundar looked out at the night sky again, realizing that the choice he would make next would define not just his role as a leader, but the legacy of his mother's silent strength. The village that carried whispers. The sun rose over the plains of northern India with a subdued warmth, painting the horizon in muted gold and pale orange. But Sundar Pichai's heart felt anything but calm. He sat in the back seat of a small government vehicle, watching the dusty roads unwind before him like a story written long ago, one that he was only now learning to read. The confidential documents from the previous night had pointed to a particular village in Uttar Pradesh, where the Silent Strength Initiative had grown remarkably in a short span of time, becoming a symbol of hope and quiet rebellion against entrenched power structures. But that same progress had drawn the attention of local groups who thrived on control and silence of a different kind. The silence of fear. Sundar had chosen to travel discreetly, with only a trusted liaison accompanying him, avoiding the glare of media and official convoys. This was not a corporate visit, not a political rally, but a personal journey into the heart of something delicate and real. As they entered the village, the first thing that struck him was the silence, not the peaceful kind he had felt under the banyan trees in Delhi, but a tense, suspended silence that carried whispers underneath. People peered from doorways, curious yet cautious, their eyes filled with questions they did not dare voice. Children paused their games to watch the unfamiliar car roll down the narrow path lined with mud houses and faded walls. The liaison pointed to a small building at the edge of the village, a learning center built with community hands, its walls painted in cheerful colors but marred by recent graffiti scrawled in red. The words were harsh warnings meant to intimidate. Sundar felt a chill, not because of the threat itself, but because of what it represented, a deliberate attempt to crush fragile hope before it could fully bloom. Inside the center, a group of women greeted him with nervous smiles. They were the heart of the initiative here. Teachers, mothers, and quiet leaders who had turned a humble room into a place of transformation. Their eyes carried both pride and worry. One of them, a woman named Shanti, spoke softly but clearly, explaining how the program had started with a few tablets donated by a volunteer. Within months, children who had never touched a device were building basic apps, exploring educational resources, and connecting with students in other villages. Their quiet success had drawn admiration from surrounding communities, but it had also unsettled powerful intermediaries who controlled access to education and employment. "They don't want change," Shanti said, her voice steady despite the weight behind it. "Because change means the people will stop depending on them." As Sundar listened, the room filled with stories. One young teacher recounted how men from a local syndicate had arrived late at night, warning them to shut down the program or face consequences. Another woman shared how some families had begun withdrawing their daughters from the center after whispered threats spread through the village. These were not open attacks, but carefully crafted seeds of fear planted in fertile ground. Sundar felt anger rise inside him, not loud, explosive anger, but a quiet, determined kind that burned slow and deep. He had spent years solving complex global problems, but here the battle wasn't fought with algorithms or policies. It was fought with trust, courage, and human resilience. He stepped outside the center and walked through the village, accompanied by a few of the women. People gathered slowly, unsure of what to make of him. Many recognized his name from mobile phones or newspaper clippings, but seeing him walk their narrow lanes in simple clothes was different. He paused to speak with elders sitting under a neem tree. They were hesitant at first, their voices cautious. But when he mentioned Lakshmi Pichai, his mother, their expressions shifted. Some of the women nodded knowingly, as if they had heard her name in the quiet circles where strength is passed down through stories, not speeches. One elderly man said, "We have heard of her kindness, of the way she helped without asking for anything. If you are her son, then this village will listen, but only if your words carry the same truth." Later that afternoon, a small gathering was arranged in the courtyard of the local temple. Villagers came slowly, some out of curiosity, some out of quiet hope. Sundar stood before them, not as a corporate leader, but as a son of the same soil, his voice gentle but unwavering. He didn't give them polished rhetoric. Instead, he told them the story of his mother, of her quiet strength that had inspired strangers. He spoke about how silence can be either submission or strength, and how the women of this village had chosen the latter. "Your daughters," he said, "are not just learning to use technology, they are learning to see their own worth. And that is something no threat can take away if you stand together." The crowd listened intently, their eyes reflecting a mixture of fear, pride, and awakening. After the gathering dispersed, Shanti approached him with urgency in her eyes. She handed him a small sealed note. "This was left at the door last night," she whispered. Sundar unfolded it. The message was chillingly simple. "Leave before sunset tomorrow. This silence belongs to us, not to you." There was no signature, no symbol, just the heavy weight of unseen opposition. He folded the note quietly and looked around at the faces of the women and children who stood near the temple gates. He realized that leaving was not an option, not because of pride, but because this was no longer just about one village. It was about what his presence would mean if he stayed. That night, Sundar sat with the village elders under the stars, the hum of crickets filling the air. The sky stretched vast and unbroken above them, and for the first time in years he felt truly grounded. He spoke little, mostly listening to their worries, their hopes, their whispered fears of retaliation. They told him about power structures that had existed for generations, built not on strength, but on silence enforced through fear. One elder said softly, "When silence belongs to fear, no one breathes freely. But when silence belongs to strength, even whispers become powerful." Those words settled deep in Sundar's mind. As the night grew late, a trusted local teacher approached him discreetly. "They are planning something," he said quietly. "Outsiders came 2 nights ago. They met with some men in the next village. We don't know what will happen, but something is coming." Sundar thanked him and returned to his small guest room near the temple. He looked at his mother's letter again, tracing the last line with his fingers. "When silence speaks, will you answer, my son?" He knew his answer now. The test he had been warned about was no longer distant. It was arriving perhaps by tomorrow. Before he turned off the lamp, he stood by the small window and watched the dark fields stretching into the distance. Somewhere out there, plans were being made in shadows. But here, in this quiet village, a different kind of silence was forming. One that carried strength, unity, and the echo of his mother's quiet legacy. Dawn would not come gently this time. The night the silence broke. The night in the village was unlike any sundar Pichai had ever experienced. The air was thick with an invisible tension, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Distant dogs barked intermittently, and the wind carried faint whispers through the narrow lanes like secrets passing from one shadow to another. Sundar sat in the dimly lit guest room near the temple, his mind alert despite the late hour. The warning he had received earlier that day echoed in his head. They are planning something. He could feel it, not as a vague fear, but as a quiet certainty building beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. On the wooden table beside him lay his mother's letter, the note from the threat, and the small notebook of handwritten messages from the children. Each of these carried a different kind of weight, but together they formed something like an unspoken vow inside him. He was no longer here as a visitor. He was here as someone whose presence meant something real. Just after midnight, the power in the village flickered and went out completely, plunging everything into darkness. The sudden silence was unsettling. Moments later, faint lights appeared at the far end of the fields, flashlights moving in coordinated lines. Sundar moved to the window and watched silently. Groups of men approached the learning center and temple courtyard, their movements quick but deliberate. They weren't carrying obvious weapons, but their presence alone was meant to intimidate. He quickly slipped out and moved toward the temple where a few villagers had already gathered, alerted by the blackout. Shanti was there too, clutching a lantern tightly, her face calm but her eyes sharp. "They're here," she whispered, and he could hear the tremor beneath her composed voice. Within minutes, the courtyard filled with villagers, mostly women and elders, standing in the dim lantern light. The approaching men stopped at the edge of the courtyard, their silhouettes casting long shadows across the walls. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a scarf around his neck, stepped forward. His voice was smooth, too calm for the situation. "We warned you," he said, looking directly at Sundar. "This is not your place. These walls belong to us. This silence belongs to us." His words echoed eerily, like a challenge thrown into the wind. Sundar stepped forward slowly, his face illuminated by the lantern's glow. His heart pounded, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Silence doesn't belong to those who use it to scare others," he said softly. "It belongs to those who build strength with it." The crowd behind him stirred, surprised by his calm defiance. The standoff stretched like a taut rope. The leader laughed dismissively, but his eyes narrowed. "You think your name protects you here?" "This isn't a boardroom," he sneered. Sundar met his gaze without flinching. "No," he said. "My name means nothing if I don't stand with them now." That moment, simple and quiet as it was, shifted the air. Villagers who had been hesitant began stepping closer to the courtyard, holding lanterns, forming a silent circle behind him. Their presence wasn't loud, but it was solid, unshakable. Shanti stepped beside him, her lantern held high, and one by one the women followed. The leader's smirk faded slightly as he realized this wasn't the frightened crowd he had expected. The men attempted to push forward, but the villagers didn't step back. They didn't shout or fight. They simply stood their ground with a stillness that was more powerful than any weapon. It was the kind of silence that breaks chains, not the kind that enforces them. Sundar remembered the village elder's words from the previous night. When silence belongs to strength, even whispers become powerful. And in that moment, the whispers became visible. The leader barked a few commands to his men, trying to regain control, but hesitation flickered in their movements. They were used to fear, not quiet resistance led by a figure whose name carried global weight, but whose presence here carried something even stronger: authenticity. Then something unexpected happened. One of the younger men in the opposing group stepped forward, his flashlight shaking slightly. He looked at Sundar, then at the villagers, and said, "I learned at this center too." His voice trembled, but his words landed like a stone in a still pond. "My sister goes here," he continued. "They taught us how to read, how to use computers. We don't have to stop this." The leader turned to him angrily, but the boy didn't step back. Another man, older but clearly conflicted, lowered his flashlight as well. Sundar watched as cracks began to form, not in walls but in fear itself. The leader, realizing his control was slipping, stepped forward aggressively. But before he could speak, an elderly woman from the crowd raised her voice. She wasn't loud, but every word carried authority. "This is not your silence anymore," she said firmly. "This silence belongs to those who stand together." Her voice, tremoring with age but rooted in strength, resonated across the courtyard like a temple bell at dawn. The men faltered, unsure of how to respond to this wall of calm defiance. Within minutes, the power returned unexpectedly, bathing the courtyard in sudden light. The leader and his group stood exposed, their threats less menacing under the unforgiving brightness. Sundar stepped closer to him and said quietly, "You can keep trying to control through fear, or you can be part of something that lifts everyone. But either way, I'm not leaving." It wasn't a challenge. It was a simple truth. The men withdrew slowly, not because they were forced, but because the silence they had once owned no longer belonged to them. The villagers didn't cheer or celebrate. They simply remained standing together, their faces calm but proud. The moment wasn't about victory. It was about reclaiming something that had always been theirs. Later that night, Sundar sat under the neem tree, surrounded by a few elders and teachers. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by a deep, reflective quiet. Shanti sat beside him and whispered, "They won't stop, but something changed tonight." He nodded slowly, feeling the weight of what had just happened. This wasn't a temporary standoff. It was the beginning of a larger movement, one that would ripple far beyond this village. As he looked up at the stars, his mother's words echoed again in his mind. She had never fought with noise, never demanded attention, but her strength had moved mountains in silence, and now, her legacy had taken shape in a way he had never imagined. Not through him alone, but through the collective power of those who had embraced that silent strength. Before dawn, he received a brief encrypted message from his liaison in Delhi. "The story is spreading. Villages are watching. Tomorrow will bring attention you can't avoid." Sundar folded the message slowly, his gaze steady on the horizon. The world was beginning to turn its eyes toward this quiet village, and he knew the next step would no longer be in the shadows. The silence had spoken. Now, the world would listen. When silence reached the world, the morning after the standoff dawned with a strange clarity, as if the air itself had been scrubbed clean by the silent courage of the previous night. The village, which had once carried whispers of fear, now pulsed with quiet determination. Children gathered early at the learning center, their small hands gripping tablets and notebooks with renewed pride, while elders sat beneath the neem tree, discussing plans not in hushed tones but in steady voices. Sundar Pichai stood near the temple courtyard, watching it all unfold like a scene he had longed to see without knowing it. The night's events had spread through neighboring villages even before sunrise, first by word of mouth, then through grainy videos recorded on mobile phones, carried across networks faster than anyone anticipated. What began as one village's stand had become a story people whispered in buses, markets, and classrooms. The silence fought back. As the sun climbed higher, a convoy of official vehicles approached the village. Unlike the quiet visit of his first day, this time the air buzzed with journalists, government representatives, and curious onlookers. Cameras were raised, microphones were thrust forward, and headlines were already forming in the minds of reporters eager to capture a narrative that blended technology, tradition, and resistance. Sundar, who had spent much of his career carefully navigating the public eye, now found himself at the center of a story he hadn't scripted, but one that felt more real than anything he had ever spoken about on a global stage.